So I think we'll get started. We are now live streaming on YouTube, so I'd like to formally welcome members of our community who might be watching, council members, staff, and also I'd like to welcome Natasha Jones and Tracy Riddle from Kelledy Jones Lawyers, who are going to assist with this workshop this evening on representation review. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge this land we meet on tonight is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So I'll just go through what I've been provided just to outline what we're doing tonight and some basic parameters of workshops. So this workshop session has been convened for the purpose of discussing the representation review process and to brief council members and the general community on issues relating to their decision-making function. This session will be used solely for the purpose of information sharing and not for the purpose of debating issues, building consensus positions, or otherwise discharging council's deliberative and decision-making function. There's no set agenda and no minutes will be taken during this session. A number of copies of the information presented at this session are available for council members. I'd ask everyone in the room if they can turn their mobile phones to silent, please, or off. And if they do need to take a phone call, please take it outside. Thank you. There is no requirement, I don't believe, to go into confidence, so that doesn't apply here. So that's enough for me. Now, Natasha and Tracy, I think you're going to walk us through this. I'll hand over to you guys. Welcome.
Thank you. We're going to do a bit of a tag, so there's no sort of structure in terms of who's going to speak when. We'll probably keep it fairly relaxed. This is a workshop. It is intended to introduce the council to the process, being a representation review. Just by way of indication, though, how many of you have been part of a process before? Excellent.
And Brian as well.
That makes it a lot easier. I think the last council we did, I think we might have had two in the room who actually had been part of a rep review before. So a lot of this is going to be familiar, it's not going to be foreign. And so if you've got any particular questions around process, what options there are, we'll talk a little bit about the proposed reforms and what that means for the council. And Tracy will go into a little bit more detail around the actual process and the specific timeframes. So the last time the town of Gawler undertook a representation review was back in 2012-13. And so it's a requirement that the council undertakes one in every relevant period. Now for these purposes, it's 8 years. So that time has arrived. The Minister gazetted the requirements for this council, being that the relevant period is from October this year to October next year. So there's a statutory obligation that the representation review be completed before October next year, which gives us plenty of time, although I say plenty of time. Obviously we have Christmas in all of that, and also depends upon how we go through the consultation process. So our role in this, so the role of Kelledy Jones is to facilitate the process. We'll be facilitating, clearly, any elected member workshop, to prepare any required report. That's for the purposes of consultation. And so we'll also guide the consultation process as well. You've all been provided with a timeline. So on one of the documents you have, which is on the back of the quotas, you've also got a timeline. So what we have is the proposed schedule. Those of you who recall, it's a process that's really statutory driven. So in terms of what the process is, there's not a great amount of flexibility in terms of how we go about it, because It's run by timelines, and we are pretty much told by the Local Government Act what we need to do through the process. And even so far as being detailed that we're told what needs to be considered within the various or the two reports that are our primary documents that drive the representation review. So obviously this is to start the process. This is to provide us with some guidance, some information, some feedback that will inform the representation options paper. That's what we will draft. We're in the process of drafting that now. And that will be used for the purposes of consultation. Now, and Tracy can, I was going to say kick me from under the table, but it's easier like this, you can't do that. But if I steal any of your thunder, let me know. The options paper, though, does need to address options, and we can't emphasise that enough. So despite what your inclination might be at this point in time, we do need to present to the community options. So we have been working with a couple of councils who from the outset said they're just happy the way they are. And that's good, but we do need the position is we're stuck with having to present some options. Whether that is the position that's arrived at the conclusion, it may well be, but at least we need to go through that process of examining what other options are available for the council's consideration. So that certainly will be the first part of the process. And the report, so this is to inform the report. You'll be provided with a survey that will also get you thinking around some specific questions that will also guide this council's thoughts, or at least your individual thoughts around what any options might look like, what your views are on in terms of current representation, and also taking into consideration future and what the future of this council might look like with electoral representation. Because coming back to the table, the representation quotas, one of the things that we need to consider through this is where this council sits in terms of those quotas and what is likely to occur over the next 8 years. So we're well aware of some things that might change in the next 20, 25 years, but for these purposes, we're going to be addressing what's more imminent than that. So I've been focusing on the representation options paper. That's obviously the first step. There is a 6-week time frame for consultation on that paper. That will conclude by an assessment of any feedback that's received. And that will also be guided by what this council chooses its consultation or its community engagement strategy to be for these purposes. There's clearly a minimum requirement, what the Local Government Act requires in terms of gazetting, local newspaper, notification, placement on the website, but the council might choose to do something over and above that. And some councils have done the bare minimum, others have chosen to be more creative in terms of the other ways that it wishes to engage on this particular topic. We've had a really diverse experience too. We've had a council that received any responses, but we've also had a council that's in an area that has probably more interest, more residents and ratepayers that are interested and have received a number of responses. They are then taken into account and a representations paper is then prepared, and it's that paper then, there's a further consultation period on that paper. And so it'll probably come back to the council a couple more times in terms of adopting the representations options paper for the basis of consultation and obviously the representation paper, which will essentially be putting out to the community what the council is proposing to do. And then after all of that, that's when we collect everything that relates to the entire process and present it to the Electoral Commissioner. because one thing that we must do at the end of this process is obtain the Electoral Commissioner's certification. And that's the final tick to ensure that we've met all of the requirements. I know I've probably gone through all of that already. If you are interested, or I could say if you had difficulties sleeping, I guess, but there's a lot of information available if you wish to do more expansive reading around what the representation review involves. The Electoral Commission's guidelines is probably one of the best resources to guide the process. It's a really practical set of guidelines that help understand what's required and what needs to be included each step of the way. But that's what we're obviously here to assist in any event. Well, one of the main priorities is to ascertain whether the council is going to benefit from any kind of change through the process, and that any kind of change might mean council's composition, so number of council members, or ward structures. Now, bearing in mind that you don't have those at present, but it is something that still needs to be addressed in the paper, even though it's something that may not be might not get much appetite for at this present point. Yes. It is, yes. Yeah. And so that brings in an interesting element to this. It's very much what people are used to as well. But yeah, there is a requirement for us to consider ward councillors versus area councillors. So I'm just seeing what I have covered. Yep. Oh yeah, it's up there too. It's really easier, even though I've got my glasses on. I have covered, yeah. You can flip over. These, if there are any changes, they will come into effect in readiness for the November 2022 elections. The proposed legislative changes around elected member numbers, so it doesn't affect this council because it's a proposed cap of 12 council members, has been relevant for a handful of councils. But those changes, there are some broader changes around these provisions. If they are going to come into effect, they're not, if they're adopted in their current status, they're not going to be in operation until 2026. So for our purposes, we're working with the legislation as we see it now, not as what is proposed by way of amendment. Yes. No, so there are still some councils that elect their chairperson. They're probably using the title mayor, or could be, but there are some councils that still elect from within.
It's not,
not many anymore.
Two.
Yeah, not many.
Two. And the new legislation, not that we'll work on that, has removed that.
Correct. Yes. Correct.
It'd be a brave council that removed an election. Much would be a bad move. So,
It's probably fair to say from the outset that you'd probably be going back in time. It appears as though the legislation and also historical changes in councils over time have moved towards a popularly elected mayor.
Ward custody, the ward is a big thing in this council. Many years ago, quite often comments are made, we have a ward council or an area council. All councils are area councils. Are wards really in South Australia, throughout the council, or fading on it?
Probably fading. It is.
Tracy, can you just...
Certainly one of the things that is important that is addressed as part of this process, like exactly looking at what are the benefits to having wards and what are the benefits to not having wards, and vice versa. And there are a number of pros and cons for both options, and it can include, as you've just mentioned, when there's not wards, there's the feeling then that it's sort of a shared experience in terms of the representation of the electors and the residents and ratepayers in the area, and that residents don't feel constrained just going to a particular person. Some of the cons in terms of not having wards could be an elected member who is seen to be sort of more of a doer and a go-getter might find that all of a sudden they get more people coming to them by way of residents and ratepayers wanting them to represent their interests than perhaps someone who's not perceived to have that type of persona in terms of the council chamber. So these are certainly the things, and part of our role in this process is to make sure we canvass all of those issues for your consideration as part of whether or not you retain your current structure or you consider putting in a ward structure as well.
You don't have to live in the ward to be the ward councillor, do you?
No.
That's the biggest disadvantage of it.
Yeah.
What's that?
So in terms of those that have a ward structure, that have ward councillors and area councillors, I think Adelaide City Council is the only council that has that.
So we might, if you talk, I'll try and get your mic on so people, if there's anybody listening, they can hear. So, yeah. Okay.
Certainly in working with councils who currently have wards, there's always that element of very defined interests in terms of who is representing those areas. So it is a bit of a balance, because you've got those defined interests versus collective interests when there aren't any wards. So, but again, as Tracy said, there are pros and cons.
Just Councillor Little.
Yeah, well, I was involved in the process when I was a ward councillor way back in the 80s when we moved from now known as Playford to Gawler, and we were fined, and there was no ward councillors that lived there. We were fined, we weren't getting anything done. So I put my hand up with he's now Tony Piccolo, who's our MP, and we became ward councillors. We found out then we got something down then in the progression then to the 2000, we found that really wasn't needed because we're all working as one town. But initially, what I was getting at, if we take on Hewitts, we might initially need wards for the first, say, term, and then integrate back to town councillors so that they don't feel that they're being disadvantaged by coming into the town. That's what I'm getting at. And having been involved in it before, and I think town councillors in the long run are the way to go, but initially a ward councillor is a way to get people that haven't had before involved in the structure.
No, that's a very good point, Paul. Sorry,
Ward councillors also used to be very more popular in the rural areas where you've got large geographic areas, and it makes sense then, not so much. Yeah.
It really, I think it's a really interesting, it always comes up. Sorry, David, you wanted to talk.
I was just going to, this whole process allows us to delve into that, and it probably is a really good point for boundary reform to look at having a couple of areas as ward councillors and as part of the discussion, and 8 area councillors and 2 wards, or just
Yeah.
for that initial period, because I think that's a fantastic idea.
It has a lot of merit.
And it's nearly like you've got integration counsellors or something like that.
It also
Yeah.
says you're welcome.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
we think so highly, we really want to know what you think, and we need to understand who you are. Yeah, and I think it's really worth doing. I mean, it is tricky depending on the cycle and who puts their hand up and where they live. And if you can get a good spread of people, currently we've got a really good spread of people from south, sort of Williston, call it south, call it east, whereas, you know, a few years ago there was a top-heavy representation up at Gore East. But that currently we seem to have people interested right across the town, which is just awesome. If we can keep that up, I think the area councillor thing works, doesn't it? Because we do sort of address, you know, I can look at you, for example, Paul, you know, the other night with the Humphrey George, you know, I knew what was in your head, but it was really good to have you there because you really know the area so well. Your intelligence around that area is really critical. Yeah. Yeah, no. Yeah. 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 I'm just
The mixture used to work. If you think back to Gawler, because we used to have ward councillors and aldermen. So you'd have, I think it was 3 or 4.
yeah.
And ward councillor, the aldermen floated, you know. So yeah, something to look at.
Were you alderman? Sorry, Cody. Cody's the only one doing it.
So, yeah, look, I think with Hewitt, if that gets across, I think that would be a good idea, I think, because I think where wards shine is where there are distinct communities, like council, for example, is several towns. It's not just like, you know, and that's the same for many sort of more regional councils. And here in Gawler, there's mostly one community sort of thing. I would think that perhaps areas like Cudler might be interested in having their own wards and feel like they're not necessarily represented on the council right now. But other than that, you know, there's sort of a general feel of one, you know, one council. But yeah, with Hewitt and that, I think I agree that would be beneficial.
In terms of proposed ward structures as well, the other mathematical equation that we need to take into account for those who've been involved in that type of structure is we then need to look at, so the Act certainly talks about looking at communities of interests, you know, natural features of the landscape being used as dividers in terms of making it, you know, sort of a logical type of structure. What we then need to look at is the number of electors in each of those wards, because the Act actually requires that the tolerance is plus and 10 minus %. So what that means is sort of any particular ward can't be above 10% or below 10% than any other ward that's also in the council area. So we need to carefully think about how we draw that up as well in terms of that proposal. And what that means, it's to ensure sort of the equal representation in terms of residents and ratepayers in the council area, and that you don't have ward councillors that you know, have more people potentially voting for them in a general election, or in terms of workloads as well.
I'll get you to put, Brian, can you just turn your, so everyone can hear you? Yeah. Sorry. Sorry.
Area council or ward council, I mean, you know, that's what I mean. You know, at the moment, I think we're classified as area councillors. So it's not singular, we represent the whole area. And I've always been on the point about you've always got to get information out. When our rates notices and things like that send out, I've always pushed the point that a picture of our ugly dolls and that be sent out so that people can stick them on the fridge or the dartboard so that they know who the councillors are if they need to ring. And I don't believe we do enough of that because, you know, so many people say to me, well, who's on the council? You know, so I think we've got to do a lot more publicity to let people know that If you don't want to talk to me, you can talk to Cody, or you can talk to David, or Kelvin, or Paul. And to me, that's something that I feel is missing at the moment in our community. So I'm not sure whether other councillors have found that in other council areas and what they've done about it.
So yeah, you're exactly right. And what we also see as part of this representation review process, like this is a great PR exercise for pushing out that type of information as well in terms of what elected members can do for residents and ratepayers, who they can contact, how they go about contacting their representatives on council. Because you're exactly right. I mean, just because you might be potentially going to a ward structure with ward councillors doesn't mean that any resident or ratepayer couldn't go to another elected member to raise an issue. So you still that shared interest. You have that dual role under the Act to, act as, in your role as an elected member of the chamber, but also be that conduit for the community in terms of representing their interests. So and in terms of, part of this process as well, Natasha talked about it being process driven. Effectively, we're here to make sure that, once the document gets into the electoral commissioner, it runs their ruler, their checklist over, has the council taken into account all of the things it needs to for the purposes of its review process, checks off the fact that we prove that by putting those things in the documentation that is then subject to the consultation processes, and then you get ultimately that sign-off. Part of that process is to look at your representation structure and your quotas. That's one of the other handouts that you've been given as well. That the documents actually specify that you need to put into your paper the fact that you've looked at what councils of a similar size as well as your neighbouring councils have by way of your representation of electors in the area. And so that's what that representation quota document is. That shows how many electors are in each of those areas that would be potentially comparable for the council, as well as their members. Interestingly, in terms of the discussion that we've just had, there are 5 of those councils don't have wards. So it's about even in terms of who does or doesn't have wards amongst those. And then the representation quota, what that calculation is it shows how many elected members there are per elector in the council area. The term used under the Act is electors rather than residents and ratepayers. But of course, for the purposes of your consultation process, it's anyone that's interested is able to make a submission in relation to what's being proposed. So they don't even need to necessarily live in the area if they want to make a representation. It just is a matter of how much weight is given to those types of representations that you receive. So in terms of your representation quotas, you largely sit, within your neighbours. Obviously, the outliers there are like regional council. We've got 1 member to every 957 electors, and then you've got the City of Playford with 1 member to every 3,893. So obviously, it's quite a big difference at each end of that spectrum. Everyone else tends to fall into the middle of that. They're the numbers that are looked at, and as I understand it, potentially from the conversations we've had, and we will have shortly as well in terms of building on those things we spoke about, that's the type of numbers someone like the electoral commissioner would look at if you were looking at increasing or decreasing your number of elected members as part of this process as well. So that's why it's just important to keep those assessments in mind as part of your review process.
So if the town of Gawler wasn't looking at introducing a ward system, and that the maximum number of councillors is now being capped or to be capped at 12, is really the essence of this review the question of whether we are to reduce member representation, which for a growing council is highly unlikely. Or am I missing something in terms of the substance of this whole process?
It's a really important question as well to canvass as part of this process. So at the moment, what's proposed by way of the reforms is that there will be 12 members, and that will include the mayor as part of the number of elected members in the council area. At the moment, we don't know ultimately whether or not that's going to be passed. But interestingly, when you already look at section 12, One of the things the council needs to turn its mind to, it's already specified under there that if the council is constituted of 12 members, it needs to turn its mind to, does it need to decrease those numbers? So it's, at the moment, effectively you could call it a soft ceiling that's currently contained in section 12 of the Act. What's being proposed really is that hard ceiling.
So just on that, we're not basing this review on the proposed changes though.
No, that's exactly right. Because you've now started your review process, you'll go through your process. It'll be finalised in October next year, and then it will come into effect in November 2022. It's the reform proposals will not come into effect until 2026. So all of the councils that are now within this process and have commenced this, that won't apply to them. What will have to happen though is that next time round, in 8 years' time, you will have to turn your mind to whether or not you need to look at your numbers if you've increased them as part of this process. So it does become a live issue. It does become something relevant to take into account. We don't know what the outcome's going to be. It won't be applied to you as part of this review. If it does come in, it will be something that would need to be taken into account for after 2026. So it would be at the point of the next review. We're certainly not getting any information that councils would be required to go through this process again, and nor should they in terms of the expense that it involves as well. So that's certainly not what has been suggested to us. It would just be, if they do come into effect, it would then be that any review process that was going to be undertaken after that 2026 period would need to then comply with what's contained in sections 12 and 33 of the Act. And most, the most important one being that 12 elected members, including there has been some discussion about wards. At the moment, there's no rules being proposed in relation to whether we completely get rid of wards or retain the wards. It's remaining the same.
Really,
so there had been some discussion.
It really depends on your community and the interest in local government. And if you can't get people, from my point of view, a ward should be whoever's in that ward should be living in that area. Otherwise, it's not much point. Even in an urban area or peri-urban area like Gawler, like you said, Cody, and Paul, you said, we're one group. We're quite cohesive because we're one town, and so it seems to work. I mean, you've got to always consider change. How we would bring it, if as a result of boundary reform, how we would bring in, if it was successful, and how we get those people represented is going to be quite interesting, particularly around quotas. So that's where some expert advice I think would be quite useful, and also community feedback on what that might look like, because what people might expect may not be able to be achieved, but how we tweak that so that they do get fair representation, if they come in. It's a good point. I mean, I think if there's a sort of happy number around the table, if you have too little, I think there's not enough of a voice, and if you have too many, it's too unwieldy. I mean, I think personally, and it's probably only because of what I'm used to. Again, you don't know, but looking at Onkaparinga and all the troubles they had, they've managed a lot better since they've gotten a bit smaller. But then Salisbury don't want to go down to 12. They're really happy with I think they're at 15, and they're actually advocating actively against the 12 because they're very comfortable. It's a really big council, and when you have lots of committees, you want to get involved. We've got lots of action working groups. We all want to be a part of it. I was just talking to Cody before about his workload and, how you manage that, because we want to be involved, but we can't take on too much. But how we manage that. There's only a few of us. You can't do that. You have to make decisions. You can't have so many working groups, perhaps, so that you lose a bit of representation, maybe. I don't know. It's an interesting question. So, sorry. Now, hang on, who wants to talk now? Sorry.
All I was going to say, coming back to Henry's question, was we're talking about the proposed changes. But for these purposes, there's no obligation upon this council to be looking at reducing its representation. But there would be a need to include that as at least an option in the options paper. I mean, from a parliamentary perspective, there's clearly a policy drive to reduce the number of council members, but I think the drive is really aiming at those councils that are have much higher numbers in terms of elected representatives. So I think from a practical perspective, there probably isn't going to be too much that this council will be affected by in relation to those proposals if they do become law. But for these purposes, you'd be looking at one or two options that look at a decrease in numbers, because the idea of the options paper is to present different options.
What will need to be carefully managed is your boundary reform, because as part of this process, it concludes in October next year. And so if there is an appetite to potentially be looking at wards, if those spaces don't exist as part of the council area, as we go through the options paper and the representation review report, then we can't be including them in terms of, drawing up boundaries and working out what ward quotas might look like. And so, and there is also, it's under the Act and a very strong public policy driver that the council, can only take into account in terms of its representation review what it knows now and what is knowable in terms of your numbers and your residents and ratepayers.
So even though we're going through a boundary reform process, we don't know what the outcome of that will be, but we know what the areas, and we know how many people live in those areas. Can we not do some modelling around what a ward structure would look like, or is that not allowed?
We can only do modelling around what the ward structure would look like with the council area as it is at the time that it does its representation review. So depending on the timing of your boundary reform proposal, and when we don't anticipate that it's not going to be, that it will be concluded by, within that time frame, what it means is we can certainly look at bringing in ward structures now with the space that you have at the moment in terms of the council area. But then in terms of redrawing those, that would be as part of your next representation review, potentially part of the boundary reform process itself.
You can trigger that. That can trigger a separate review, can't it?
Yeah.
So that might be what we would do, is actually, and I think you mentioned that, Henry, that's an appropriate step if boundary reform is realised.
I'm not sure if I said that, but I'm conscious that neither the boundary reform initiative nor this needs to be deferred, because I expect that we'd complete this process. The boundary reform exercise is at least another 2 or 3 years before any final decision is made, and then we're in the next cycle of boundary reform consideration. So it certainly can, both initiatives can proceed sort of in an orderly manner.
That's right, that was going to be my suggestion, was to contact the Electoral Commissioner. And we can certainly confirm that position through this process, but given you do have the two processes running, it's probably, whilst they are quite separate processes, the timing of them is relevant.
And, potentially, again, in terms of drafting the options paper, that might be one of the reasons why you don't move yet towards. It would be a relevant consideration to take into account that you might need to be looking at that proposal as part of your boundary reform later on. And it's just, all of these things just become relevant considerations as part of the process. So, and we've touched on, and as Natasha said, and it's really great that a number of you have been through this process. I know it's a few councillor takers. We have had, some elected members get a bit confused about, why are we looking at wards? Why are we looking at numbers of members? Why are we looking at whether or not we're going to keep the mayor? It is just simply because that's what the Act says that we have to look at. And for the purposes of your options paper and then your final report that we send to the Commissioner, we just need to show the Electoral Commissioner that you've actually turned your mind to those things. And so that is the list of things that we will canvass for the purposes of your consideration, which then goes out as part of your first public consultation. We've already mentioned when we say mayor or chairperson, chairperson is the term that's used by those regional council who elect their presiding member, as it was, from within. But certainly what we're seeing is most councils have a mayor, and that's what is certainly being prescribed under the reforms as well. So number is always going to be an issue, not as much for this council, because again, as we've already said, your membership certainly sits within both what you currently need to turn your mind to by way of 12 members and what is being proposed, noting though that is not something that you need to be concerned about yet. As Tash mentioned before, really in terms of some of the public policy rhetoric behind the proposed amendments, and looking at terms of capping elected member numbers, it seems to us as part of this process, it's those councils that's looking at increasing their membership of their elected members that will probably have the harder sell, as it was in terms of their representation review process. But of course, if that was something we wanted to consider as part of this process, we just need to provide the justification around that. And we've spoken about how you go about electing your members and whether it's part of a ward or a no ward situation. So they're the things that you need to turn your mind to as part of your options paper. As Natasha mentioned, the next key stage is the preparation of that paper, which we do from you, but we base that on the feedback from you in terms of what you want to see by way of the options to be canvassed as part of this process. What is proposed in your options paper is not ultimately, what. So one of those options will potentially be the option that you then move forward with at the end of the process. But the options paper is really just that. It sets out what options you have thought about and putting it out to your community to see what it is that they think about that. And so as part of that process, it would be good potentially to see what they might think about a ward proposal, for example, by way of this representation review process, as well as maintaining what it is that you're currently doing at the moment. Noting what the Mayor said, that of course this is not a decision-making forum, it would be really useful for us to we've got some really great feedback, but it would be useful for us to get some more feedback from you about what it is you'd like to see in that options paper so it does represent what it is that you're looking for as part of this process. We do have a questionnaire for you to take from this process, from tonight's workshop, so that you can start jotting down some more thoughts. But if anyone had anything else that they'd like to add or they'd like to see in there, it would be really great to hear from you in relation to those things now. Cody?
Oh, hang on. Went to Cody first. Deputy Mayor.
That's right. So just on the question of the representation quota, is there a sort of ideal sort of ratio that they're looking for, or is there something we should be working towards in regards to our quota?
So those figures are really looked at in terms of, so if, for example, you were a City of Salisbury, with 15 members and a mayor, and they were potentially looking at wanting to add 3 members. And then as part of its options paper and its representation review report, it's got a report on what that actually looks like. And so in terms of the representation of the council area, that then becomes a relevant consideration as part of the process, and then ultimately for the Electoral Commissioner in relation to whether or not there might be over-representation, for example, or can it, is there a justification for that? So that's why it's important to have a look at that table, because certainly in terms of where you sit now with your representation, you're very much within the ballpark of your neighbours as well as councils that have a similar structure and a similar size in terms of Gawler. So it's used as a comparator, and it's more useful in terms of if councils are looking at potentially increasing representation. So, our view is where you currently sit in that certainly gives no rise for concern in terms of your current representation in the area.
And I think you've got to look at your community as well. So this is just a number on the page, and not all these councils are growth councils, some of them are. And you look at specifically at what we're doing and what we want to be involved in, and have we got the number right? Do we need more? It's going to be a hard sell to get more, but if we go down less, what does that mean for our workload? We know what the workload's like. We also know what we want to be involved in, and and the issues of Gawler being a growth council. So I think there's a sort of a number of layers to what we need to consider, I think.
And it's, we've certainly found looking at cost is a blunt tool in terms of, the suggestion that if you've got less members and that's going to translate into less cost for council. That's not necessarily the case because, as you've mentioned, Mayor, you then have more elected, there's less elected members doing more of the work in terms of time, and then there's additional administration time that needs to go then into doing the work of council. So it can't simply just be a cost factor in terms of looking at representation number. It has to be about what that means for your communities, what that means for your elected members, and what that means for the projects and the strategies that you've got coming up in terms of driving those as well, as well as your communities of interest. So, making sure that you don't have those communities slipping through the cracks if you've got less representation.
Kelvin? Sorry, Brian.
My turn? Oh. Tracy, one of the big things that's always bothered me, and I go back to when the wards were around and that sort of thing, and I live up in Gawler East. I'm up there because the floods won't get us. But basically, we always had a ward area council, a ward councillor. And it's funny talking just recently to a group of people because of a few development issues up there. They all said, when are you going to become back and bring the wards back in? And I said, well, do you really see the advantage of that? And of course, I think we all know that we're lucky to get 30% of people that vote. And that is the biggest problem that we have. Is there any way that anyone has come up with the silver ball and said, how do you get people to actually fill out that form, which is free, and so forth? My father, as a councillor, was a central ward councillor with the businesses because he owned the BP service station and that. And what stunned me coming back onto council last year or so is the fact that we have 295 businesses in Gawler and 5 voted. Now, when the business people of Gawler say, you councillors, you don't support us, you don't do anything, la, 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 la. I said, well, hang on a minute. Did you vote? And you know why they didn't vote? Because in the mail, they got a letter from the council. And as soon as it came from the council, it went in the bin. And my challenge, certainly now as a councillor, is going to, even if I've got to walk to every one of them, you have a representative to vote for. I mean, the largest employer in the town and that sort of thing never stated any votes at the last election for an elected member. And the thing is, as you said, that, and as Mayor Karen said, at one stage, everybody was from Gawler East, but at the moment, it's a real spread councillor of councillors in different areas. And the wards, I believe, would certainly work, and especially out into the eastern area here if the boundary changes go our way and all that sort of stuff. But our biggest challenge is, how do we get that person? Do we put a chocolate in every envelope that we send out? Please, all you got to do is fill it out and send it back. But that, I think, is the biggest worry, that we're not getting the community to come on the train with us to run our community and our town.
So no one has found that silver bullet. It's a perennial problem of all councils, and it's, nobody engages with council on the good news stories. It's the bad news stories, or when something's gone wrong. That, you know, unfortunately, that's when you tend to hear from most of your residents and ratepayers. But,
Horrifying suggestion.
But, you know, so unfortunately, you know, we see it all the time. So many people don't engage in the budget process, you know, so the amount of information that people could get from their local council if they engaged in that process as well in terms of what was being done in the council area. But you're right, key to that is, you know, your role as elected members in terms of, you know, being that PR spokesperson, as assisted by, you know, councils have, you know, particularly the social media forums are good. So most councils will have Facebook pages and as well as its websites in terms of engaging with members of the community. Unfortunately, you know, in terms of these processes, you know, more people should be engaged in the representation review process. So part of the challenge for us here as well is to make sure your options paper is accessible to members of the public so they understand what the process is, because it can be a confusing, you know, driven process by the Act that, you know, then if they feel a bit lost, they might then not put in their feedback. But it's part of that whole, the totality of the journey in terms of trying to engage them on all those different levels.
Sorry. I'll just take Paul. Sorry, Natasha. There we go.
Yeah, when I was elected first time to council back in the dim dark ages, we had polling booths. Now, and we as councillors who were trying to be councillors, we had to put out how to vote cards. They had to be registered with the councils and everything else. I can remember trying to find people to man my 4 polling booths. And I found that people like going out and sort of participating in the voting process. I think we lose a bit when we post it out. I know it must be cost saving, but is that an option we could look at? Because I know I've been spoken to some of the older people I talked to when I was walking around. Said, oh, I missed the old days with the polling booths, because they like to socialise. To them, a bit of paper coming in the mail is not socialising. And so I don't know, it's a stupid thing, I know, but we have federal and state elections at polling booths, and we used to do it for councils. I don't think the turnout was any different. I think it was the same sort of percentages. It's just, it seems to be more, I don't know, it was more people and community involvement. Kelvin's nodding his head because he was involved in the first process as well. And we had to work our butt off a bit harder than what I did last time, which I must admit was, last time getting elected was a lot easier than the first 3 times I got on, because I had to go out and canvass my wards, knock on doors, put the vote cards out, have people in polling booths to make sure they knew how to vote. There was no how cards given out, you know, you had to do it. So I found that process a lot better than the current one.
It's actually quite difficult, isn't it, to change legislation? And I know the LGA has put up about electronic voting, online voting, and that's just, it's almost impossible to even have that conversation, because the pushback is, oh, it's all too hard, there's voter fraud and we're not ready yet, and so nothing happens, and so we're stuck with you know, postal voting, and that's fraught with danger as well. Yeah, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that. Who'd like to?
I think it's one of the, well, it is a process that's driven by the Electoral Commissioner. So that's where the accountability is in terms of what this process looks like, and also legislative change. I think we're not going to touch on any of that through the representation review. However, it is a lingering issue that remains unaddressed, and obviously the LGA and recently the Electoral Commissioner taking responsibility for that marketing of increasing voter participation is clearly at the forefront. Unfortunately, my personal view is I don't think we're going to see polling booths return anytime soon, particularly in the current environment. I think it to a degree it comes down to individual councils and how individuals are engaged.
Okay, so it's 8 o'clock. Any other comments, elected members?
Which might be a silly question, but can elected members put in a private submission when we do the consultation, even though they make that decision?
There's nothing to prevent you from doing so.
there any move by the state government to make it compulsory? My son lives in Queensland. It is compulsory to vote at council elections.
Yeah,
You
it
don't
is.
get fined.
Mm. I'd love to see compulsory voting for local government elections. Seriously, that's the only way we're going to get more people voting. Yeah.
I think if my memory serves me correctly, it might have been 3 rounds ago. I think it was something that was being contemplated, but it just hasn't got traction to any significant degree here.
Sorry, just on that issue, just be aware in terms of putting in personal submissions, you might potentially be giving yourself conflict once your options paper and your representation review report come to the chamber, because at the moment, your representation review process is one of your ordinary business exemptions for the purposes of the conflict of interest provisions. But if you start then taking steps, for example, like putting in something like personal representation, then you're potentially pulling yourself out of that.
Any other comments, elected members, for Tracy and Natasha? No? No? Happy? Okay, well, thank you very much, ladies, for coming along and giving us that sort of step-by-step process of what we're about to undertake, and we look forward to the draft options paper. Yeah, when do you want the, thank you, Paul, when do you want the questionnaire back? 1 week, 2 weeks? And hand it back to Kate? Give it back to Kate? Okay, so 1 week or 2 weeks? 1 week? One? Okay, 1 week. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So I think we're moving on to the chairperson's workshop. Is that right? Okay. Thank you, ladies. And have a good trip back. Shall we have a 5-minute break?